The morning of June 4th, 1942, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the flag bridge of the largest warship ever constructed, watching the empty horizon 600 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Around him, officers bent over charts and radio equipment, their movements precise, measured. Below his feet, 72,000 tons of steel displaced the Pacific Ocean. 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship, pointed toward an enemy that would never come within range. Each barrel could hurl a 3,220-pound shell over 26 miles. The armor protecting the ship's vital spaces measured over 25 inches thick in places, enough to stop any projectile any navy in the world could fire. Yamato was the material embodiment of 30 years of Japanese naval doctrine, the ultimate refinement of a single idea, that wars at sea would be won by superior battleships, engaging in a decisive surface action. By nightfall, that doctrine would begin to collapse, not because Yamato had failed, but because she had never been given the chance to succeed. The Imperial Japanese Navy had commissioned Yamato just 1 week after the attack on Pearl Harbor in a ceremony deliberately muted to preserve secrecy. American naval intelligence would not learn the true specifications of the ship until captured Japanese sailors revealed them under interrogation, and even then, Allied intelligence publications continued to list Yamato's main battery as 16-inch guns as late as December 1944, 4 months before American aircraft would sink her. This secrecy was intentional, meticulous, expensive. During construction at Kure Naval Arsenal, workers had erected canvas screens over portions of the dry dock. Security personnel screened the surrounding hills. The Japanese government told its own citizens nothing. Even among naval officers, only those with direct need knew the full capabilities of the vessel under construction. The reason for this secrecy was strategic. Japanese planners understood that any American battleship built to counter Yamato would need to transit the Panama Canal to reach the Pacific. The canal's locks imposed a maximum beam of 110 feet. Yamato's beam measured 127 feet 7 inches. No American battleship capable of matching her could physically reach the theater of operations without sailing around South America, adding months to deployment time. This was calculated advantage, engineered into the steel itself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The construction of Yamato began on November 4, 1937, after more than 2 years of design work that produced 23 different blueprints and tested over 50 hull models in hydrodynamic basins. The engineers faced unprecedented challenges. The 18-inch guns alone weighed 147 tons each, more than many destroyers from the previous decade, and measured 69 feet 3 inches in length. Each 3-gun turret weighed more than a 1930s-era destroyer. The ship's designers had to create an entirely new class of vessel to support this armament. They deepened the dock by 1 meter. They installed gantry cranes capable of lifting 350 tons. The final design called for a standard displacement of 64,000 tons and a full load displacement of 72,000 tons. The propulsion system, 12 Campon boilers, feeding 4-shaft geared steam turbines, generated 150,000 shaft horsepower, driving the massive hull to a top speed of 27 knots during sea trials in October 1941. The armor scheme was equally unprecedented. The main belt measured 16 inches thick. The Marti, faces of the main gun turrets, carried 25.5 inches of armored steel. The armor deck over the magazines measured 8 inches thick, with provisions to protect against underwater explosions. In total, the armor mass reached 22,534 tons. The metallurgy was not perfect. Japanese steel proved roughly 20% less resistant to penetration than equivalent American armor, but the sheer thickness compensated. The ship carried a crew of over 2,700 officers and enlisted personnel. She was equipped with 7 aircraft and 2 catapults for launching reconnaissance seaplanes. Air conditioning, a rarity on any warship in 1941, was installed throughout. Sailors who served aboard later remarked that even at the top of the command tower, there was no pitch or roll when sailing, as if they stood on solid ground. To understand why Japan built Yamato requires understanding the doctrine that shaped every decision of the Imperial Japanese Navy for 3 decades. The Japanese called it Kantai Kessen, the Decisive Battle Doctrine. The concept had its origins in the writings of American naval historian Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose theories on sea power had influenced naval thinking worldwide. But for Japan, Mahan's ideas took on the force of religious conviction following the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. During the Russo-Japanese War, Admiral Togo Heihachiro led the Japanese fleet to a crushing victory over the Russian Baltic Fleet in the Tsushima Strait. The Russians lost 8 battleships and 4,800 men. The Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats and 110 men. It was the most one-sided naval victory in modern history, achieved through superior training, superior gunnery, and concentration of force. The lesson was clear, or so it seemed. A smaller, better trained, better equipped fleet could defeat a numerically superior enemy in a single climactic engagement. This victory validated what became known in Japanese naval circles as Taikan Kyoho Syugi, the principle of big ships and big guns. If Japan could build battleships superior to any potential enemy, and if Japanese gun crews could train to a higher standard than any navy in the world, then Japan could defeat even the United States Navy in a decisive surface engagement. The geography of the Pacific seemed to favor this approach. The U.S. Pacific Fleet would be based in Hawaii, over 4,000 miles from Japan. Any American offensive would require the fleet to cross vast distances, consuming fuel and supplies, degrading operational readiness. Japanese planners envisioned wearing down the American fleet through submarine attacks and air raids as it advanced westward. Then, when the Americans reached the Mariana or Marshall Islands, roughly 1,400 miles southeast of Japan, the Japanese battle fleet would engage them in the decisive clash. The Americans would be exhausted, reduced in numbers, far from their bases. The Japanese would be fresh, concentrated, operating near their own supply lines. Japanese battleships, with longer-range guns and heavier armor, would devastate the American fleet. A negotiated peace would follow. Japan would retain its conquests. The empire would endure. By 1934, this thinking had become so entrenched that the revised battle instructions stated without equivocation, battleship divisions are the main weapon in a fleet battle, and their task is to engage the main force of the enemy. That same year, the Navy General Staff secretly approved plans to build 4 super battleships. Yamato was the first. But even as Yamato's keel was being laid, dissenting voices questioned whether the age of the battleship was ending. Advocates of naval aviation argued that aircraft carriers could project power far beyond the horizon, striking enemy fleets before battleships ever came within gun range. The new technologies of submarines and torpedo bombers threatened to render the line of battle obsolete. These advocates found their champion in Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who assumed command of the combined fleet in August 1939. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity in ways many of his colleagues did not. In January 1941, months before the outbreak of war, Yamamoto wrote a memorandum titled Views on Military Preparations. In it, he argued that the ascendancy of aircraft and submarines meant the single great decisive battle would never take place. He called for the Navy to expand its air forces and train commanders for numerous small engagements rather than one climactic clash. But Yamamoto's influence had limits. The conservative old guard, admirals who had built their careers around battleship doctrine, dominated the Navy General Staff. They could not accept that. Aircraft carriers should supersede battleships as the fleet's primary striking arm. The investment in Yamato and her sister ship Musashi represented too much institutional momentum, too much national prestige, too much strategic calculation to abandon. The carriers would have a role, certainly, but the battleships would deliver the final blow. So Yamato was completed, and on December 16, 1941, she was formally commissioned at Kure, becoming the flagship of the combined fleet under Admiral Yamamoto, the very man who had questioned whether such ships still had a place in modern naval warfare. The aircraft that would render Yamato's guns irrelevant was, by most measures, an unremarkable machine. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was a low-wing, single-engine scout bomber with a two-man crew. It measured 40 feet 8 inches in length, with a wingspan of 41 feet 6 inches. Maximum speed was 255 miles per hour, painfully slow by fighter standards. The SBD-3 model that equipped American carriers in June 1942 carried two forward-firing half-inch machine guns in the engine, cowling and twin 30-caliber machine guns in the rear cockpit for the radioman gunner. The bomb load was modest, 1,000 pounds, typically a single bomb mounted on a centerline cradle beneath the fuselage. The bomb release mechanism used a wishbone design that swung the bomb clear of the propeller arc during the near-vertical dive. Pilots called it slow but deadly, a sardonic nickname that acknowledged both the aircraft's limitations and its lethal effectiveness. What made the Dauntless dangerous was not speed, or armor, or firepower. It was the dive-bombing technique itself, refined through years of training. A Dauntless pilot would approach the target at altitude, typically 15,000 feet or higher, then roll inverted and pull through into a 70 to 80 degree dive angle. The aircraft was sturdy enough to withstand this nearly vertical plunge. Perforated dive brakes on the trailing edges of the wings deployed automatically, controlling the descent speed and keeping the plane stable even as it screamed toward the target at terminal velocity. The pilot aimed through a telescopic sight mounted in the cockpit, making continuous corrections as the target grew larger. At around 1,500 to 2,000 feet, low enough that missing was nearly impossible, high enough to survive the bomb's blast, the pilot released the bomb and pulled out of the dive, subjecting himself to forces approaching 6 times normal gravity. The gunner in the rear seat, experiencing the same crushing G-forces, remained alert for enemy fighters during the vulnerable pullout. The technique required extraordinary skill and extraordinary courage. Anti-aircraft fire intensified as altitude decreased. The dive took roughly 30 seconds from initiation to bomb release, 30 seconds during which the pilot was committed, unable to evade, focused entirely on placing the bomb precisely on target. Enemy fighters could attack from above during the dive or chase the bomber during its pullout. The rear gunner provided the only defense. Yet this vulnerability was also the source of the Dauntless's lethality. High-altitude level bombing, as practiced by B-17 flying fortresses, achieved hit rates of roughly 2% against ships at sea. Dive bombing achieved hit rates approaching 40%. The difference was physics. A bomb released from altitude was subject to wind drift, calculation errors, evasive maneuvering by the target. A bomb released from 1,500 feet was essentially a ballistic projectile on a nearly straight trajectory. The carrier deck or battleship deck rushed up to meet it with minimal time to react. By June 1942, American carrier squadrons had developed standardized dive-bombing doctrine. Multiple aircraft attacked simultaneously from different angles, saturating defenses, preventing effective evasive action. The bomb itself was typically a 1,000-pound Mark 13 general-purpose weapon with a contact or short-delay fuse. Penetrating a carrier's wooden flight deck required no armor-piercing capability. The bomb punched through into the hangar spaces below, where aviation fuel, armed aircraft, and ammunition created catastrophic secondary explosions. A single 1,000-pound bomb, properly placed, could transform a carrier into a flaming wreck within minutes. This was not theoretical. At the Battle of Coral Sea 1 month earlier, Dauntless dive bombers had proven the concept by sinking the light carrier Shoho and severely damaging the fleet carrier Shokaku. The technique worked. The doctrine was established. The crews were trained. All that remained was the opportunity. 10:20 hours, June 4th, 1942. 3 squadrons of American dive bombers, 37 aircraft from Enterprise and 17 from Yorktown arrived simultaneously over the Japanese carrier force through a combination of skill, determination, and extraordinary coincidence. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu steamed in formation below, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The carriers had just recovered their combat air patrol fighters after repelling multiple torpedo bomber attacks. The fighters were at low altitude. The carriers were vulnerable. The dive bombers pushed over. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's strike, assigned his squadron to Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best's squadron targeted Akagi. The Dauntlesses rolled inverted and pulled through into their attack dives. From the carriers below, anti-aircraft crews saw death approaching at terminal velocity. They had perhaps 15 seconds to react. The first bomb struck Kaga amidships, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the upper hangar. The explosion touched off stored torpedoes and aviation fuel. A second bomb hit near the island superstructure. A third struck aft. Within moments, Kaga was burning from stem to stern. Akagi might have escaped. McCluskey had assigned 2 squadrons to 2 targets, violating doctrine that dictated the trailing squadron attack the near target. But Lieutenant Best, realizing Kaga was doomed, made a split-second decision. He led just 3 aircraft against Akagi, while the rest of his squadron followed McCluskey. Best's bomb struck Akagi's flight deck amidships, penetrating into the hangar where armed and fueled aircraft awaited launch. The blast ignited fires that would burn for 9 hours before the carrier had to be scuttled. 1 bomb, 1 aircraft carrier. Simultaneously, Yorktown's squadron under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie attacked Soryu. 3 bombs struck in rapid succession, transforming the carrier into an inferno. The entire attack, 3 carriers fatally damaged, took 6 minutes. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, a radar officer aboard Yamato 600 miles to the northwest, would later recall the confusion aboard the flagship as fragmented radio reports filtered in. The information was incomplete, contradictory. Carriers burning, carriers sinking, enemy dive bombers. The scope of the disaster took hours to comprehend. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding from Yamato's bridge, initially ordered a night surface engagement, hoping to bring his battleships within gun range of the American carriers. But the American carriers withdrew eastward, refusing the engagement Yamato had been built to win. By 0:15 hours on June 5th, Yamamoto cancelled the operation and ordered the fleet to withdraw. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Yamato had steamed within 600 miles of enemy carriers, closer than she would come again until 1944, and had never fired her main battery. Her 9 18-inch guns, each capable of hurling 1.5 tons of steel 26 miles, remained silent. The decisive surface engagement for which she had been designed never materialized. The decisive engagement had been fought and won by aircraft operating from ships Yamato could have destroyed with a single salvo, had those ships ever come within range. But they never would. The paradigm had shifted. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was aboard Akagi during Midway, would later write that the battle marked the moment when Japanese naval officers began to understand that carriers, not battleships, would determine victory in the Pacific. The understanding came too late. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, sunk or scuttled. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors dead. Most critically, over 700 aircraft mechanics and maintainers lost, specialists whose training took years and whose skills could not be quickly replaced. Japan would build more carriers, but the pool of experienced pilots and crews had been devastated in a single day by an attack lasting minutes, delivered by aircraft. Japan's battleships could neither prevent nor counter. The implications became clear in the months that followed. Yamato returned to Japan, then moved to the anchorage at Truk Atoll in August 1942. There she would remain, with brief interruptions, until May 1943. The period would later be referred to sardonically as Yamato's service as the Yamato Hotel. While American and Japanese forces fought desperately for Guadalcanal, the first major American counteroffensive Yamato sat at anchor. The reasons advanced for keeping her out of action varied. Fuel shortages, lack of bombardment ammunition, the restricted, shallow waters near Guadalcanal, unsuitable for a ship with a 36-foot draft, her slower speed compared to the Congo-class fast battleships. But underlying all these practical concerns was a deeper reluctance, the recognition that committing the most powerful battleship ever built to a battle dominated by carrier aviation and land-based aircraft was to risk losing her for no strategic gain. The decisive battle Yamato had been designed to fight would not occur in the Solomon Islands. It would not occur anywhere. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers was profound. Shigeru Fukudome, chief of the operations section of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, had described Yamato and Musashi as symbols of naval power that provided to officers and men alike a profound sense of confidence in their navy. Some Japanese citizens believed their country could never fall as long as Yamato was able to fight. But confidence built on material superiority means nothing when that material never engages. Admiral Matomi Ugaki, who had participated in the planning for Midway, later questioned in his diary why Japanese planners always sought a decisive battle, rather than attacking vulnerable elements of the enemy fleet. The question revealed the intellectual crisis. The entire structure of Japanese naval doctrine, 30 years of planning, training, construction, had been predicated on bringing superior battleships to bear in a climactic surface engagement. When that engagement proved unattainable, when American carriers operated beyond the reach of Japanese guns, the doctrine collapsed. And with it collapsed the justification for ships like Yamato. The Battle of Midway resulted in a significant rethinking of Japanese naval doctrine. The emphasis shifted from battleships to carriers. Aircraft carriers were recognized as the primary striking arm, capable of attacking enemy units beyond the horizon. Surface units, including battleships, were relegated to a supportive role. But this shift came too late. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, and more critically, the experienced pilots and aircraft mechanics who made carrier operations effective. Replacing the carriers took 2 years. Replacing the trained personnel was impossible. American industrial capacity was producing carriers, aircraft, and trained pilots faster than Japan could match. The qualitative edge Japan had sought through superior battleship design became irrelevant in a war decided by carrier aviation and logistics. When Yamato finally did engage American surface forces during the Battle off Samar in October 1944, she fired her 18-inch guns at American escort carriers and destroyers. She straddled the escort carrier White Plains with salvos that sent geysers of colored water hundreds of feet into the air, but scored no direct hits before the Japanese force withdrew. It was her only surface action against enemy warships. She sank no ships. On April 7, 1945, Yamato was sunk by American carrier aircraft torpedo bombers and dive bombers, including the Curtiss Hell diver that had replaced the Dauntless during a suicide mission to Okinawa. She took 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs before capsizing. Of her crew of over 2,700 men, only 269 survived. The largest, most powerful battleship ever constructed had been rendered obsolete by aircraft carrying 1,000-pound bombs, flown by pilots who had trained for precisely this mission, executing a doctrine proven effective 3 years earlier at Midway. On the morning of April 6, 1945, 72,800 tons of obsolescence departed Tokuyama Naval Base. Yamato led a force of 10 warships, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers south through the Bungo Strait toward Okinawa. Admiral Seiichi Ito commanded from Yamato's bridge. Vice Admiral Ito had initially refused the mission outright. When informed that Emperor Hirohito himself expected compliance, Ito accepted his fate with resignation. The operation was designated Tengo, meaning Heaven Number 1. Everyone involved understood it was a suicide mission. The ships carried enough fuel for a one-way voyage, though reportedly base personnel secretly loaded additional fuel in defiance of orders. The plan called for Yamato to reach Okinawa, destroy as many American transports and landing craft as possible, then beach herself and serve as an immobile artillery platform until destroyed. Any surviving crew would go ashore to fight alongside the garrison until death. None aboard expected to return. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese transmissions detailing the operation. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, ordered submarines to track the Japanese force and prepared his battleships for surface action. But Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58 with 16 fast carriers, requested permission to strike with carrier aircraft instead. Spruance agreed. The message to the carrier commanders was succinct. You take them on. 2 American submarines, Threadfin and Hackleback, spotted Yamato's force transiting the Bungo Strait on the evening of April 6th. They shadowed the formation, transmitting position reports reportedly uncoded, allowing Japanese radio operators to intercept them and understand they had been detected. At dawn on April 7th, as the Japanese force steamed south through the East China Sea, American reconnaissance aircraft located them. Martin Mariner flying boats maintained discreet contact, hidden in clouds, tracking Yamato's course for 5 hours. Yamato fired her special anti-aircraft shells, 18-inch rounds filled with incendiary material and shrapnel, designed to create aerial bursts, but the flying boats remained beyond range. At 12:20 hours, the first wave appeared on radar. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, the same radar officer who had served aboard Yamato at Midway, watched the contacts resolve on his scope. 3 large formations, 280 aircraft, Grumman F-6F Hellcat, fighters, Curtiss SB-2C, Helldiver dive bombers, Grumman TBF Avenger, torpedo bombers. The force split into coordinated attack groups. Fighters strafed the decks, suppressing anti-aircraft fire and drawing attention from the bombers. Dive bombers attacked from multiple angles. Torpedo bombers, having learned from the sinking of Yamato's sister ship Musashi 6 months earlier, concentrated their attacks on the port side, only a deliberate tactic to induce asymmetric flooding and accelerate capsizing. The first torpedo struck at 12:41. Then bombs, then more torpedoes. Yamato maneuvered desperately, turning hard to port, then starboard, attempting to evade the coordinated attacks. Her anti-aircraft batteries fired continuously. She had been refitted with over 150 25mm guns for this final mission, but the volume of attacking aircraft overwhelmed the defenses. By 13:30, Yamato had taken multiple torpedo hits to port. The ship developed a severe list. Captain Kosaku Ariga ordered counter-flooding of the starboard engine room to correct the list, knowing the action would doom the 300 men inside. The pumps were overwhelmed. The list continued increasing. At 14:02, 3 more bombs struck amidships. Captain Ariga gave the order to abandon ship. At 14:17, the ship was struck by additional torpedoes to port. The list passed 15 degrees. At 14:23, Yamato rolled completely onto her port side and capsized. Her forward magazines detonated. The explosion sent a mushroom cloud visible 100 miles away on Kyushu. When the smoke cleared, Yamato was gone. Of her crew of 2,767 men, only 269 survived. She had been destroyed by the very weapon system that had rendered her obsolete 3 years earlier. The loss of Yamato confirmed what military analysts had understood since Midway. The age of the battleship had ended, but the implications extended beyond naval doctrine. Yamato represented the culmination of a strategic philosophy, the belief that qualitative superiority could offset quantitative inferiority, that individual ships of unprecedented power could substitute for industrial capacity. Japan had bet its naval strategy on building battleships no enemy could match, operating them in a decisive engagement that would force a favorable peace. The fundamental flaw was assuming the enemy would accept that framework. American naval doctrine evolved faster than Japanese planners anticipated. By 1942, the United States Navy had reorganized around carrier task forces, relegating battleships to escort and fire support roles. The decisive surface engagement Japan had planned for never occurred, not because American battleships were superior, but because American carriers kept them beyond battleship gun range. Yamato's entire operational life from commission in December 1941 to sinking in April 1945 encompassed just 3 years and 4 months. During that time, she fired her main battery in anger exactly once, at the Battle of Samar in October 1944, when she and other Japanese heavy units attacked American escort carriers and destroyers. She straddled the escort carrier White Plains with near misses, but scored no confirmed hits before the Japanese force withdrew, fearing the approach of American fleet carriers. It was the only time Yamato's 18-inch guns engaged surface targets. She sank no enemy ships. The contrast with aircraft carriers was stark. The Essex-class carriers that dominated the final 2 years of the Pacific War displaced 33,000 tons, roughly half Yamato's displacement. They carried air groups of 90 to 100 aircraft. A single Essex-class carrier cost approximately $70 million to build. Yamato cost roughly $250 million more than 3 Essex-class carriers. Yet those carriers could project power hundreds of miles beyond the horizon, strike multiple targets simultaneously, and remain relevant throughout the war. Yamato projected power only to the range of her guns, 26 miles under ideal conditions, less in combat. Her massive armor protected against threats that never materialized. Her enormous guns engaged targets that never came within range. The strategic miscalculation was not in Yamato's design. She was magnificently engineered, but in the assumption that battleship-centric warfare would remain dominant. Technology had shifted the paradigm. Japan recognized the shift too late to adapt. The human cost was equally profound. Yamato's construction consumed resources that might have built multiple carriers or hundreds of aircraft. Her operation required a crew of over 2,700 highly trained specialists. When she sank, she took not only those lives but also the institutional knowledge, experience, and training they represented. In a war of attrition, such losses were irreplaceable. Japanese naval power had been built around experienced personnel operating superior equipment. When that personnel was lost, as at Midway, as at Yamato's sinking, no amount of industrial effort could quickly replace them. The United States, by contrast, developed training programs capable of producing thousands of competent pilots and sailors annually, supported by an industrial base that manufactured aircraft and ships faster than they could be sunk. Japan could not match this production. The decisiveness of Midway demonstrated another strategic reality. Concentration of force created vulnerability. Japan had committed 4 fleet carriers to the operation, believing their concentration would overwhelm American defenses. When American dive bombers struck all 4 carriers within hours, Japan lost not just the ships but a substantial portion of its naval aviation capability in a single day. Dispersion might have been safer, but dispersion contradicted the Decisive Battle Doctrine. Kantai Kessen demanded concentration for the overwhelming blow. When that blow failed to land, the concentration became catastrophic vulnerability. Yamato's story is ultimately about the collision between doctrine and reality, between faith and evidence, between the world as planners imagined it and the world as it actually was. For 30 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had prepared for a specific kind of war, a war decided by battleship gunnery in a climactic surface engagement. They built institutions around this vision. They designed ships to fulfill it. They trained officers to execute it. And when war came, they discovered the vision was obsolete. The decisive battle they had prepared for would never occur, not because they lacked the ships or the courage or the skill, but because their enemy fought a different kind of war entirely. The morning of June 4, 1942, should have been the moment of validation. Admiral Yamamoto directed operations from Yamato's bridge, confident his plan would draw out and destroy the American carriers. Instead, American dive bombers operating from those carriers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in a matter of hours, while Yamato steamed 600 miles away, her guns silent, her purpose unrealized. That morning revealed a truth that Japanese naval leadership struggled to accept. The weapons they had spent decades perfecting were irrelevant to the war they were actually fighting. This was not a failure of craftsmanship. Yamato was magnificently designed, brilliantly engineered, impressively constructed. Her armor was the thickest ever mounted on a warship. Her guns were the largest ever deployed at sea. Her fire control systems were sophisticated. Her crew was professional. None of it mattered because the fundamental assumption that battleships would determine naval supremacy was wrong. Wars are not won by fighting well, according to outdated doctrine. They are won by adapting faster than the enemy, by recognizing shifts in technology and tactics before those shifts become irreversible disadvantages. Japan recognized the shift. Admiral Yamamoto understood it, arguing in his 1941 memorandum that aircraft and submarines would determine the Pacific War. But institutional momentum, strategic investment, and doctrinal rigidity prevented adaptation. The battleships were built, the doctrine remained, and men died implementing strategies that could not succeed. The irony was profound. Japan built Yamato to secure a decisive advantage through qualitative superiority. She was superior, the most powerful battleship ever constructed. But superiority in an obsolete weapon system provides no advantage. A sword is superior to a club, but neither defeats a rifle. Yamato was the sword in a rifle war, magnificent and irrelevant. Her sinking on April 7, 1945, by aircraft she could not engage, from carriers she could not reach, executing tactics she could not counter, was the final proof of a lesson learned 3 years earlier, but never fully accepted. The cost of that lesson was measured in ships sunk, sailors drowned, battles lost, and ultimately in a war Japan could not win. Yamato's legacy in Japan remains complex. She is remembered as a symbol of national pride and technological achievement, but also as a symbol of futility and waste. The word Yamato itself, a poetic name for Japan, ensures the ship's story resonates as metaphor. Her destruction marked not just the end of a battleship, but the end of an empire's faith in military supremacy through traditional means. When Yamato capsized and exploded on that April morning, she took with her the last remnants of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine that had shaped Japanese naval thinking for a generation. What remained was the recognition, purchased at catastrophic cost, that the age of the battleship had ended not with a climactic surface engagement as planners had envisioned, but with aircraft dropping bombs from above, executing a doctrine proven effective years earlier by ordinary planes carrying 1,000-pound bombs, flown by pilots who understood that wars are won not by fighting well, but by fighting correctly. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.